Welcome in, everybody, to this Kansas City Chiefs roster prediction show presented by Bleacher Report. I'm your host, Michael Darcy, and over the course of the next 25 to 30 minutes, we're going to go over some players that I think will make the final 53-man roster, and unfortunately, some players that are just going to miss the mark by just a little bit. So before we get into the first four in versus the first four out, I kind of wanted to talk about the Chris Jones situation while some of you guys are getting into this chat. So the Chris Jones situation has been all over the place. A lot of Chiefs fans are concerned that he's not going to play this season for the Kansas City Chiefs. I personally think that he will report. Will he report by the time that the first game starts? I'm not sure. But I do think that he will play for the Kansas City Chiefs in 2023. But the real question is going to be when he's going to report. I would say at least by, week 2 or 3. But the Chiefs are in kind of a standing contest with Chris Jones. They're seeing who's going to budge first. And right now, it kind of looks like they're in a standoff. And so we'll see who ends up budging first. But I do think that Chris Jones will be on this team and playing on this defense by week 2 or 3 at the latest. So with that being said, going over the Chris Jones situation, let's get into the first 4 players that I think will make the final 53-man roster in 2023. The first guy comes as a surprise to some, but not a surprise to others. And that guy is wide receiver Justin Ross. I think Justin Ross has had a phenomenal training camp. He's looked really good in the preseason. In that first preseason game, he didn't get a lot of playing time with the ones, but he excelled in the second, third, and even kind of into the fourth quarter. He caught a touchdown pass in that first preseason game, and the social media team for the Chiefs just absolutely put that clip out everywhere. And so I think that Justin Ross, based on his training camp and how he's performed, and not just performed, but how he's been utilized by the offense in the preseason, is a very telling sign that he's going to make this roster. I think that Justin Ross, with the first preseason game performance, probably solidified his job. He's probably going to slot into the 6th, maybe 7th wide receiver spot. That's not saying that he couldn't be potentially a number 3 or 4 wide receiver, maybe even higher as the season goes along. But the most important thing is I think he makes this roster. And if you would have told Chiefs Kingdom this last year, they would have thought it was a no-brainer. But if you've been paying attention to the Justin Ross situation, he's been injured. He's had a lot of hype and a lot of noise around him. But, we were always concerned about his durability and his injury history. And he was able to make it through an entire training camp and a preseason without getting hurt. Granted, we still got one more preseason game left to go, but we're not going to talk about that. I don't want to jinx it. But Justin Ross, I think, is a guy that he's really progressed. In camp, he was fantastic. His route running ability is second to none. I mean, he just looks so good. And I think that this is definitely going to be a player who can fill in, play with Patrick Mahomes, which we saw in that second preseason game. And he's a quality option. The Chiefs have another quality receiver, which a lot of the outside media did not think the Chiefs had going into this offseason. So I think that Justin Ross is going to be the first in the first 4 in. And I think that he'll probably be slotted at your 6th or 7th wide receiver on the depth chart, depending on how many wide receivers they take. The second guy that we're going to talk about is backup quarterback Shane Buechele. Shane Buechele is a very interesting candidate to talk about because earlier this offseason, the Chiefs went out and they signed backup quarterback journeyman Blaine Gabbert. And Blaine Gabbert has been a backup quarterback for a while now. He was just in Tampa Bay backing up the GOAT in Tom Brady. And so I was kind of like, okay, since they signed Gabbert, what does that mean for Shane Buechele? And it almost kind of felt like, we like you, Shane Buechele, but you're not our guy. But during the preseason and during training camp, Shane Buechele is really impressed. And this has kind of been a guy that I've overlooked in the past. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but I've overlooked him in the past because he just kind of got buried on the depth chart, so to speak. But the way that he's played in both camp and in preseason, I think it is almost, he's made the case that he could be the second quarterback, the backup quarterback to Patrick Mahomes. And if you look at that second preseason game, he was a perfect 10 for 10 on passing. He threw for 105 yards, and he scored a rushing touchdown. That drive, that series was really good and really impressive, but that's what he's been doing all throughout camp. So I'm almost thinking that Shane Buechele is forcing the Chiefs' hand. The Chiefs had an issue last year where they had to promote Shane Buechele to the active roster because they literally couldn't let Shane Buechele sit on the practice squad because another team was going to steal him based on how well he was performing. I want to answer this question from the chat. ZL11 said that Prince might go to the practice squad so that they can call him up when they trade CEH around 4 to 6 weeks. It's an interesting point. I'm glad you brought it up. I'm going to address that further on in the stream because maybe that's a player that I have as the first 4 in, or maybe that's a player that I have at the first 4 out. So you make a really good point, but it is going to fit in to this, overall live stream. I agree. Nightmare 4 said Buechele looked great against the Cardinals. I mean, Buechele was really efficient, and that's the kind of stuff that you want to see from your backup quarterback. You're not expecting your backup quarterback to come in and play like the starter, because if they did that, they'd start in the NFL. But Shane Buechele is a guy that I think could come in and just be okay, do his job, kind of like Chad Henne. Chad Henne was not a world beater. He wasn't an all-star. He wasn't a superstar by any means. In fact, if you look at his career stats as a starter, he was pretty bad. He was really bad. But when he got in this Andy Reid system, he learned that all he had to do was trust in Andy Reid and do his job. And that's exactly what he did. And you don't win the Super Bowl without Chad Henne as your backup quarterback. So if anything, that only stresses the importance of having a good backup quarterback. And I think that Shane Buechele, unfortunately, is almost getting caught in the football politics side of things, where I think Andy Reid wants to go with the veteran in Blaine Gabbert as the backup. But that doesn't mean that Shane Buechele is not going to make this final roster. I think the Chiefs are going to have to carry 3 quarterbacks because unless you're okay with another team picking up Shane Buechele, it wouldn't really make a lot of sense for the Chiefs to not add him on this roster. So who's going to be the backup quarterback? I think it's either going to obviously be Shane Buechele or Blaine Gabbert. I'm actually leaning towards Blaine Gabbert. I think he's probably going to be the guy that Andy Reid trusts to get the job done more. But I still think that Shane Buechele is going to make this final roster because the Chiefs have been developing this guy for the past couple seasons, and it would be kind of a waste if he just got picked up by another team and was no longer here. So I think in order to ensure that he doesn't get swiped off the practice squad, Shane Buechele will make the final 53-man roster. The next guy that we're going to talk about, a name that has already been brought up in the chat, and that is running back Deneric Prince. Deneric Prince was a really big name in camp, a guy that, quite frankly, I hadn't heard of before this offseason. He was a UDFA out of Tulsa, and right away he got a lot of hype, a lot of publicity. The Chiefs players that often either make the team or make the practice squad or become fan favorites generate a lot of hype and a lot of buzz during training camp. And Deneric Prince did that. He was a guy that a lot of people were comparing to Isaiah Pacheco, who had a stellar preseason and training camp the year before. And Deneric Prince was, drawing a lot of similarities to Isaiah Pacheco. But kind of as camp progressed, he was running with the ones. He had a good camp. Don't get it twisted. For a UDFA to generate that type of buzz, it's really only something that you see from a guy like a Justin Ross, who has been in this game for a long time and would have been a blue chip prospect if he didn't get hurt. That's not the story of Deneric Prince. He was a UDFA who came in just fighting for a job. And I don't want to say that I was disappointed with his preseason performances. He did score a touchdown in that second game against the Cardinals, granted in like the third or fourth quarter with I don't even remember who was the quarterback, and a lot of the backups were in who just aren't going to make this team. But the reason that I think Deneric Prince is going to make this roster is because he is more valuable in terms of special teams. I think when you're fighting for, that second or third running back on the roster or carrying a 6th or 7th wide receiver, you need to look at ways that they can be multi-beneficial. Can they do multiple things at a high level to keep their roster spot? They're not as talented as a guy like, Kadarius Toney. Kadarius Toney doesn't have to do special teams. He will, but he doesn't have to in order to keep his roster spot. A guy like Deneric Prince is going to have to kind of earn his plate on special teams in order to work up to a bigger role. And so I think that Deneric Prince is going to have to be that guy on kickoff returns, and the Chiefs were doing that a lot in the preseason of having him return kicks. And I think that that is a good sign of things to come. Maybe that they're trying to get him to take over that role for Isaiah Pacheco. But outside of him getting a lot of first team reps in camp and first team reps as a kickoff returner in the preseason, I was kind of disappointed. I didn't think that he had the greatest preseason by any means. I want to address this comment by Coleman Daniel 13. He said, we need Deneric Perine as an inefficient runner. It's funny that you said that because I actually think that it's going to come down, that third running back spot is going to come down to either La'Mical Perine or Deneric Prince. And the only reason that on this list I have Deneric Prince getting the nod is I just think that he's more valuable in terms of like what he brings to the special teams unit. And we don't really know who Dave Toub's guys are. I always say that every year there's a couple guys that make this roster that are, quote, Dave Toub, quote, guys who just play special teams at a very high level. Marcus Kemp is a perfect example of that kind of player. He always make the roster. He would never get to play as a receiver, but he was such an elite special teamer that he always had a job. Deneric Prince is going to have to fight on special teams. I'm not sure if he's a Dave Toub guy. Quite frankly, we don't know. But I would assume that him getting a lot of first-team reps as a kickoff returner, I think that might bode well for him. And that's why I think that he's going to make this team. But if he doesn't make this team, I still think that he's going to be on the practice squad. And with the running back room being as, injury-prone and volatile as it is, I would not be surprised if Deneric Prince ended up getting his shot some point this year. But that's another thing. The running back room with all the injuries, no one's guaranteed anything. Isaiah Pacheco is going to be your starter, but he's even had injury problems. And so who knows what that position could look like 2 or 3 months from now. So it's going to be a good thing to keep Deneric Prince open as an option, even if he's on the practice squad. But I do think that he makes the final cut on the final 53. The final player that I think is going to make the 53-man roster in 2023 is tight end Matt Bushman. Matt Bushman is a very interesting candidate to talk about because I might have been singing a very different tune almost just 2 weeks ago. So if you know how the Chiefs run their offense, they love to use big body tight ends. And recently, in the past couple seasons, they've been carrying 4 tight ends. Or maybe they'll carry 3 tight ends and 1 H-back or what's a fullback. Who was our fullback? I can't remember. Michael Fulton, I believe, was our fullback last year. We are not having him anymore. We don't have a fullback right now, which is kind of weird because Andy Reid always loves to have a fullback. But the Chiefs usually carry 4 tight ends. And in the past, they've gone Travis Kelce is your obvious tight end 1. Blake Bell. You have Jody Fortson in years past. And Noah Gray. And Noah Gray's looked really good in camp, which we should talk about too. But right now, the Chiefs have 3 guys that I think are solidified at your tight end position. And that's Travis Kelce, Blake Bell, and Noah Gray. The 4th guy is usually Jody Fortson. Jody Fortson's on IR right now. I don't think that he's going to play in 2023. And I think that almost kind of pushes Matt Bushman to the front and center of the line because Matt Bushman is a guy that I know the Chiefs are very fond of. He's been in this system for a couple years now. I remember talking about him at training camp last year, and he was a UDFA, originally signed by the Raiders, but the Chiefs picked him up. He's looked good in camp. I think Matt Bushman is going to be your tight end 4. He's a big body guy. He offers a lot in terms of blocking, but he can also catch the ball. So I think that he's going to give you not the same effect and production that Jody Fortson gives, but I do think that it is going to be another quality guy that can be a good blocker for you. And that's why Matt Bushman is going to be your tight end 4 for the Kansas City Chiefs. And that is my first 4 in for the 2023 final 53-man roster. So let's talk about some of the players that will not make the cut. And these ones are good. Let's start off with the first one, and that is running back Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And somebody commented earlier talking about how, we need Deneric Prince because we're going to trade Clyde in the future in the next 4 to 6 weeks. If you've watched any of the preseason, you would be well aware that the Chiefs have been almost force-feeding Clyde Edwards-Helaire every single game. And he's been running with the first team and getting a ton of just usage. But even in that sample size that we're seeing from him, I hate to say it, he's not been good. He's not been good whatsoever. And unfortunately, I'm at the point with Clyde Edwards-Helaire that you know what you're going to get. He's not going to magically turn into this Pro Bowl caliber running back overnight. I think that what we have seen from Clyde Edwards-Helaire over the past couple years is what we're going to get. We're not going to see a rejuvenated new version of Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He's done. We've seen everything that we could possibly see. Like I said, the Chiefs have showcased him all preseason long in an attempt to hopefully find a potential trade suitor. And I don't think that Clyde has helped his case at all. I don't think anybody is interested in him right now because he hasn't been that good. And there was a play that comes to mind in that second preseason game where Clyde became a blocker and ended up getting called for holding, I believe, because he was just like 5 inches shorter than the guy that he was blocking. And so we had to hold him. I hate to say it, Clyde, outside of being vertically challenged, is just not the player that we thought that he was going to be. We thought that coming out of LSU, he was an explosive running back that could take advantage of big gaps and could really make a guy miss and, score touchdowns. And he has not been that guy for the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs have a pretty decent offensive line. You see guys like Jerick McKinnon and Isaiah Pacheco take a lot of advantage behind these guys blocking for them, but Clyde has never been able to make that adjustment, never been able to do anything in this league. And given the sample size from what we've seen, I don't think that he's going to make this team. Whether or not the Chiefs trade him, that's very interesting. I see Quillen Brink says trade CEH for JT. If the Colts traded Jonathan Taylor for Clyde Edwards-Helaire, I would personally fly to Indianapolis and shake the owner's hand because that would never happen. That would be the most lopsided trade you could possibly have. But it's funny because both those players are actually in the same draft class. I think a lot of Chiefs fans would have rather the Chiefs drafted JT over Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but you can't change history. But I don't think that Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to make this team. And if for some reason that he does make this team, unfortunately, the only reason that he would make this team is because he was a first-round draft pick a couple years ago. That is the only reason that I could see him making this roster. And that's kind of the bad part about football is there's the political side too, where the Chiefs feel like they haven't really gotten the full return on their investment. But unfortunately, I don't think that you're ever going to see a return. So I think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the perfect candidate to get cut. It's interesting because, they almost, I don't want to say they almost cut him, but last year during the Super Bowl, Clyde was perfectly healthy and ready to go, and they straight up just deactivated him. He could not suit up and play in the Super Bowl because they just didn't want him. They didn't think that he was, worth a roster spot, and I just don't think that this year is going to be any different. So he's going to be traded or released or maybe sent to the practice squad. I'm not too sure, but I just don't think that he's going to have a roster spot. And if he does have a roster spot by some miracle, he's not going to play. He's not going to play at all, especially if you got guys like Isaiah Pacheco and Jerick McKinnon running the ball at a very high rate. So Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to be my first 4 out. The second guy is an interesting candidate also, Tershawn Wharton. I have him missing the team right now, and he's kind of in a tough spot because he's rehabbing from injury. He tore his ACL last year in week 5, and he's been rehabbing ever since. And he's missed a lot of the offseason practices because he's had swelling in that knee, which it sucks to cut a guy due to injury. And the Chiefs have a lot of problems on the defensive line right now. But I think it's kind of tough for the Chiefs to rationalize giving Tershawn Wharton a roster spot when he's not healthy. He's been out for nearly a year, and you've got a lot of young guys that can take over that spot. Tershawn Wharton's been a solid player. It was a great story. He was a UDFA that came from a college in Missouri, and I think he's had a solid NFL career for the Chiefs, but I also don't think that he's a player that you need to have in order to be successful. The Chiefs have a couple guys waiting in the wing. Danny Shelton, I don't know if you've ever seen him. He's a monster of a man. Keandre Coburn, their draft pick from this past draft, I think he could take that spot. He might not offer the same in terms of pass rush, but Tershawn Wharton didn't offer a ton of pass rush in the first place either. ZL11 says CEH to Cincy, get some draft capital back and let them handle the ticking time bomb, and he's paired with Burrow again. The only way I could see that happening is if Joe Burrow himself petitioned to get Clyde Edwards-Helaire, which maybe he's got his other LSU target there in Ja'Marr Chase, but I would have a really hard time thinking about the Chiefs trading CEH to Cincinnati. Let's see what Wharton out. Disagree with that one, bro. I do want to point out that Wharton, the only reason that I have him not making this final roster is because he's injured. Because he's injured right now. Do I think that it's going to be, one of the three that I mentioned that makes the roster? Yes. Keandre Coburn's a lot because he's a draft pick. So it's really the battle between Tershawn Wharton and Danny Shelton. And Danny Shelton's been playing a lot in the preseason, and Tershawn Wharton has not been playing in the preseason. So when it comes down to it, I think that Tershawn Wharton just hasn't had the game reps that Danny Shelton has had. And so that's why I think that Shelton's going to get the nod over him. But I would not be surprised whatsoever if Tershawn Wharton has a roster spot after he comes back and he's fully healthy. The next guy that I wanted to talk about had an electrifying second preseason game. And that guy is wide receiver Ihmir Smith-Marsette. Ihmir Smith-Marsette lit it up in the second preseason game against the Arizona Cardinals. He had 4 receptions for 92 yards, and he scored a touchdown. I mean, you saw him. He was doing flips and making acrobatic catches. He's looked really good in the preseason. He's been a name that has been brought up in the wide receiver core a lot this offseason. It was Ihmir Smith-Marsette and Nico Remigio. He's been another guy that before he got hurt, there was a big conversation about him as well. But Ihmir Smith-Marsette not making the roster is really unfortunate, but he just kind of falls on this squad at the wrong time. The Chiefs have a wide receiver problem. They have too many. They've got Justin Ross and you got Justin Watson, who's going to probably make this roster. And so Ihmir Smith-Marsette, who's had a really good preseason, is just the odd man out. And that's why I think that he's not going to make this roster. I think he's going to go down to the practice squad. And quite frankly, I don't think that he's going to be on the practice squad for very long, because all of these other NFL teams, they saw what he did against the Cardinals in the preseason. And they're like, we want that guy. And so I think that Ihmir Smith-Marsette is going to get sent down to the practice squad. Some other team is going to snatch him up based on his film. And, he's going to get to play somewhere in the NFL, which good on him. I think that he definitely deserves a spot somewhere. I just think that the reason that I have him not making this roster is the Chiefs just have too many players at wide receiver. And when we're getting down to, are we taking 6 wide receivers? Are we taking 7 wide receivers? You're going to have to give at a position. And I think that the Chiefs already have so many locks at wide receiver that they really cannot afford to take Ihmir Smith-Marsette. And so for that reason, I have him not making the team, but maybe he lights it up in that third preseason game and forces the Chiefs' hand. But I do think that I'm confident with my belief that he's going to get sent down to the practice squad and probably be there for a couple weeks and then get the call from somebody else. Few Are Chosen says that if they cut Justin Ross, I'll root against the Chiefs. I wouldn't go that far. I think we are still Chiefs fans at the end of the day. But I also think if you've watched this stream from the beginning, Justin Ross is basically a lock to make this team. He's had such a good preseason. He's looked so good. And you can kind of just tell by how the coaching staff has utilized him that he's going to make this roster. So I would not have anything to worry about if I was you. But I would also say that if one player sways your fandom, maybe reevaluate that. But another comment from Brawny77, talk about Albert O being cut by the Broncos. I think he'd be a good fit over Bushman. He could be. I remember he was the Mizzou tight end that played with Drew Lock. That could be an interesting thing to take a look at. I will say that Bushman has been in this system for a couple years, and so I think that he might get the nod over a new guy like Alberto. But that is a guy that you could definitely take a look at and maybe make the argument that he could be a player in this system one day. And the final player that I have missing out on the final roster is DiCaprio Bootle. If you guys have been Chiefs fans long enough, you'll remember the days of the banter between Chiefs Twitter talking about how it's going to be DiCaprio Bootle and Dan Sorensen as safety. And people got so excited about that combination. And all I'm going to say is thank God that never ended up happening. Dan Sorensen has fallen off a cliff. I love Dirty Dan, but he got really bad. And DiCaprio Bootle, he's been here for the past 2 seasons. He's been on the practice squad both years. I just don't think he offers anything to this team. I really don't. The Chiefs have a ton of safeties that, quite frankly, are better than he is. And DiCaprio Bootle's just been a practice squad name that in the beginning had a lot of hype, but as he's began to be in this system, he's just kind of an average player. And I don't think that he's a guy that is ever going to play in the NFL. He's a practice squad safety, and I think that's kind of where he deserves to be at. So I think DiCaprio Bootle is going to be the final guy that doesn't make this roster, and I'm okay with that. The only guy that, really was tough to talk about in this video, at least for the not making the squad, was Tershawn Wharton. I could definitely see Tershawn Wharton making this team if, Danny Shelton doesn't get the nod, but I do think that injury history is something to take a look at and take into account when you're talking about who's going to make the final roster. Because I think the Chiefs look for multiple phases and aspects in a player when it comes to a roster spot, especially once you get down towards some of the lower guys on the totem pole who are really fighting for that spot. Ihmir Smith-Marsette could play special teams. DiCaprio Bootle could play special teams. That would be the only logical way I could put them on this roster. And even then, a guy like Justin Ross, who I think is a lock to make this team, he can play special teams. He'll do it. I think Matt Bushman, he would definitely play special teams, kind of like Jody Fortson has done in the past. So I think the Chiefs are looking for guys that are not only good at their position, but can also be good options on the special teams unit. So I do think that the Chiefs have some tough decisions to make in terms of who's going to make this final 53 and who's not. But I will say we're probably going to be surprised when the final 53 comes out. There's going to be a guy or two that, whoa, he didn't make the roster, and it's going to have some Chiefs fans upset. But I do think that you got to have trust in Brett Veach and his roster-making decisions. It really is, he's a magician. He's very good at what he does, and I think that, in Veach we trust. And I really do think that he's going to pick the right guys for this final 53. I want to address this final comment before we get out of here by ISM1205. He said, who do we slot in for Jones until he ends his holdout, Wharton or Shelton? And that's tough because the Chiefs are in a difficult position where you don't have anybody, whether it's Wharton or Shelton or Keondre Coburn or Derek Nottie, you don't have a single person that could possibly fill in for Chris Jones and give you the right pass rush production. I'm only looking for a guy that can stop the run. And Derek Nottie's been the guy that can stop the run. He's basically, that's all he's good for. But I don't think that anybody on the Chiefs roster is capable of matching the level of production that Chris Jones brings. And that's so important that you get Chris Jones back at some point this season. But I don't think that you can replace that production, so you're going to have to force it in other ways. We're going to see a lot more blitzes. Look at Chamari Connor in the preseason. They've been sending him at the quarterback all preseason long. The Chiefs are going to get creative. Steve Spagnuolo is going to get creative because that's what they've done when they haven't been able to force pressure with their front four. But to answer your question, I do think that either Danny Shelton or Derek Nottie is going to fill in that slot until Chris Jones comes back. So that was, well, to recap, the first four in, the final guys to make the 53-man roster in 2023. I have wide receiver Justin Ross. I have quarterback Shane Buechele. I have a running back Deneric Prince. And I have tight end Matt Bushman as the final guy on the 53-man roster. And the first four out, I have Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Tershawn Wharton, Ihmir Smith-Marsette, and DiCaprio Bootle. So it's going to be interesting time to watch, see who gets cut, see who gets on the team in 2023. But like I said earlier, I got full confidence in Brett Veach that he will get the job done. I have had a blast talking to you guys over the past 25 to 30 minutes. You guys can check me out on social media at @TheMichaelDarcy. Also check me out on YouTube at KC Sports Report, where I cover the Chiefs much more in depth a lot during the week. So if you want to find me on YouTube, that's at KC Sports Report. Until next time, guys, this has been your host, Michael Darcy. Thank you for listening to the Final 53-Man Roster Prediction Show presented by Bleacher Report.